Shapiro, right, is a documentary filmmaker, writer, podcaster. Among other great films, he wrote and directed Islam and the Future of Tolerance, which is based on the book of the same name by atheist and neuroscientist Sam Harris, and a conversation that he had with the former Islamist extremist, really, Maajid Nawaz. Jay has also produced a series for Sam Harris's Making Sense podcast. He's worked closely with him, highlighting and discussing some of its most intriguing topics, and is now producing another series with Annaka Harris on the topic of, I think, it's on consciousness and
theory of mind and consciousness stuff. Nothing to do with probably the subject we're going to talk about today. But very deep. Just as a little pin for that, for the theory of mind consciousness nerds out there, you're going to love it. It's sort of, if you've read her book Conscious, it sort of picks up on that and takes it further on very existential questions of fundamental consciousness and the edges of experimental physics and all kinds of fun.
It's all over. I think stuff. Like Jay and I have been like we've talked a lot about all kinds of topics, so it's like really difficult to. But I mean, this time we're going to focus on a specific topic, and I'll get into that right now. But we've always, I think you have a wide variety of interests, and they're always really, really great to talk to you about. Jay also hosts a podcast called Dilemma, which focuses on important questions around. I think there's a lot of focus on moral philosophy, focus on current events, topics of public discourse. And this Dilemma, it really sort of lives up to the name. And you co-hosted with, different people before, like Coleman Hughes, for instance. And recently, and this is why I wanted to talk to you again here, is you put out and I got to tell you, it's an excellent series. Just one of the just the most reasoned and the smartest analyses out there on Palestine, called the Palestine Collection. Palestine Collection, right? And that is still ongoing, it seems.
I think so.
So again, Jay and I have talked about the importance of free speech before a lot, and so today I wanted to invite him on to discuss what's happening across America's Ivy League universities with all of the campus protests, and also sort of putting them against a backdrop and in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict and its history, which is the focus of your current series. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Old friend. It's always good to talk to you and see you. Yes.
Yeah, same. So I want to get to the protests in a bit, but first I want to talk a little bit about the series that you've put out. So it's the Palestine Collection. The first episode, you really kind of lay out what it's going to be. And I really recommend that episode, the first inaugural episode of it, where you talk about some very fundamental concepts that people should be aware of as they engage in this discussion. And then subsequently, you have interviews with, Gideon, Levy, got Richard English on does terrorism work, which is a sort of a pretty courageous question to ask and dive into. Miko Peled, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but
that's right.
Somebody who was a sort of a staunch Zionist who went to a pro-Palestinian activist, so kind of explores that transition. You've got Israeli historian Ilan Pappe, and then you do break down some of your disagreements that you have with people that you've worked with in the past, right? As well, like Sam Harris and Coleman Hughes. So can you talk about what motivated you to begin this series and, why you think it's important right now?
Well, on the personal level, I think this. I like being on the other side of the camera and helping. I'm a writer and a filmmaker, and I like helping craft messages for other people and putting things out. So in the immediate aftermath of October 7th and the discussions, I guess like the quick answer is I was pretty dissatisfied with the people who you mentioned who have large platforms, who I was just seeing make just atrociously bad mistakes in thinking, mistakes in reasoning, mistakes in moral philosophy, that vast just gaps in their knowledge of history that I felt were incredibly relevant. And so I felt, after a lot of frustration behind the scenes, trying to nudge people into directions that I thought were helpful, I just couldn't help but do it myself. I thought a lot about who to reach out to. Of course, all these names, people are very busy right now. So I sent a ton of, I knew these names and I sent out a ton of requests to people who I thought would be good, but I wanted to do them in a specific order. And then here's maybe an interesting answer, and people will see this if they watch through the show. In so many ways, the audience for that collection is my mother, who is a lovely mother, but very much trapped in the ideology of what really is Zionism. But very few people would kind of recognize themselves in that, which is true of most people who are stuck in ideologies. And I know the tone of the show, I think, is for people who I think deep down must be struggling on some level with the position that they are at, viewing the events in the world. No one likes to see death. I don't care how much bluster people have. No one likes to see these kinds of things. I even hold that to be true of, let's call it, deranged ideological minds that claim that they like it and it's holy blood. Yes, I guess I know they would say this kind of thing, but I am of the belief that deep down there are, I don't want to go into the whole sort of thing I laid out in the show, but this must be making a lot of people uncomfortable, all of this.
Yeah.
And it's for them. And my mom is one of those people with Zionism, and it's for them to help walk them through. So the order of the events, or the order of the situation, I think it's important to talk about the history first. And I don't know if we'll get into a lot of that here, but I think it's important. I think the most crucial thing we need to do now, particularly for Americans, is to get them to understand why what the Palestinian cause is, which is it's disingenuous, false, and insane to cast it as just another jihadist Islamist, sort of like they're just like ISIS or whatever. That oversimplification, it's not even an oversimplification, it's just a flat out like bonkers lie. And this doesn't mean that there's not there's religious justifications and religious language laden in all kinds of the violence. But if you understand the history of the Palestinian cause and you're honest with it, like if that's where you end up, I think you have an agenda. I'm just going to be honest. Either I think you have an agenda, or I think you're afraid to look for something that might be a little bit more complex. So that's where I started, and it's Gideon Levy. In full disclosure, it was supposed to be Ilan Pappe, but he got sick, and so that's why he's last, because I wanted to put it out. But Gideon does a lovely job and a great job talking through 1948 and sort of how this ball got rolling, which is not 1948, it's really 1897. So I had some of my color in there. And then second, you mentioned in Richard English on this big question of sort of what's the difference between terrorism and resistance. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and we tackle that. And it's the most important question, I think, right now, or it's coming. Like, I don't think people are really quite ready for it. We're still dealing with like anti-Semitism kind of becoming a meaningless word, but the word terrorism becoming a meaningless word, or being used as just pure propaganda to shut down arguments is really next. And maybe we're getting there in the next few months or years. And we need to prepare ourselves mentally, and using historical anecdotes and everything else. We need to talk about that. So that's next, to kind of prepare people to maybe, yes, be horrified by violence. Violence sucks, but kind of be a little bit more skeptical about labels we put on all of it that are just meant to, I'm sure you know this on every show. Everyone gets asked to condemn a list of things before they say anything. I'll tell you, I condemn condemning. That's the only thing I condemn. I think it's the dumbest way to start every argument, but it's, you must condemn this violence or this violence or this violence. So that shows kind of to like pull the plug on some of that bullshit. And then the third one is Miko Peled. And I know he says things that for someone like my mother, it's like you got to ease people into that level of discourse where it's just, for some people, it's a lot to swallow. Like, this is very, very hard. This is decades and decades of kind of assumed ideology and unquestioned, a lot of sunk cost, raising your kids in certain ways. I mean, we're talking deep psychological costs. I'm one of those children, right? So that's my, I won't walk through the whole thing, but people should watch it. I
really recommend. I think that if they start watching the first episode. It's just, you begin watching the first episode, the first part of the series, and it's really, really hard to stop
Thank
after
you.
that.
And I cry at the end, just as a spoiler alert, in my final speech. So it just got to be too much, but it was heartfelt too. But yeah,
I know
it's pretty exhausting. It's exhausting.
Yeah, it's a very difficult topic. But you're talking about the meaning of words, and that's kind of what I wanted to do. And especially now, so many things are being overused, that they're becoming meaningless, which is unfortunate in some ways, because these words actually do mean some things. They're real. There are people who are victims of genuine terrorism or victims of genuine anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hate, all of that. And it's unfortunately, it's a disservice to them that, we overuse and throw around these words so loosely now, especially with social media and everybody, having a say that they've just become meaningless over time. So one of these words, right, that I hear, especially the community that I came from, the place where I grew up, is Zionism, right? So different people have different definitions of Zionism. I actually think a lot of times, what's happening is that people have different documentations of what they think is happening. And I mentioned this in a previous episode, is that, for instance, if you ask most people, most Palestinians, if they support October 7th, they're going to say that they do. So Israelis will interpret that to mean, they support burning people alive and raping and torturing people. But when you ask them if they think that happened, they say, no, that's not what happened. We don't believe that. That's a conspiracy. So they have, and then the same thing, the Palestinians are going to hear that Israelis, most of them support the war, the operation in Gaza. And so they think, oh, wow, they support, the bombing and indiscriminate killing of our children. But when you ask the Israelis, they're like, no, we don't think those numbers are real. They haven't seen a lot of those videos there. So there's so much miscommunication, so much misunderstanding around what's happening and what these things mean. So I wanted to start with that, is just ask you, when you say Zionism, what do you mean? Is there a version of it that is reasonable and acceptable to you, and the opposite?
Yeah, this is a tough one. This is a question, obviously, that is on a lot of people's minds. For me, I don't know how else to answer it other than sort of a historical review and observation of self-proclaimed Zionists and the behavior, rhetoric, sort of combination of the two, what they say and then what they do and how they behave, to try to answer that and decipher that. That's the best I can do. There are people who want to use the word and be like, oh, it just means a safe place for Jews somewhere in the world. And who wouldn't support that? This very innocuous thing. When people say the Zionist entity, it can only, that's why for somebody who wants to ignore history here, they're going to end up very confused about everything you just said, right? They're going to think everyone's a freaking lunatic, or the other side, or just bloodthirsty, whatever it is. Zionism, the nice thing about it is you do not need to go into ancient history for this. Of course, they refer to it. They use biblical justifications, plenty of them. But it's 1897. You start with Theodore Herzl and you start understanding and following this project. It was a project. It was a mission to establish a homeland for the Jews. They would say returning to a biblical one, right? There was other choices like the Uganda plan. I think we all wish we had a time machine to see what.
And Herzl was not a religious
Jew. He had a Christmas tree and everything. So. But what happened to the movement, or what happened to the idea of Zionism, we could just argue about, because I think pretty quick, and he died only 4 years after he wrote the book. He wasn't really leading the charge into the 20s and 30s of this project. But
and I want to say it's the 1920s and 30s for all the kids out there. I know that we have to remember that, when we say turn of the century, we're talking about 2000. So
we're getting older. I characterize it, I guess, without getting into all of the details, as a project which was in cooperation, was working in cooperation, could only exist, could only sort of manifest into an actual on the ground effort through the British Empire, which had, well, even at the time of the 1897, did not yet have the Palestinian Mandate, but with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, they kind of already carved up the Ottoman Empire. And by the time 1917 rolls around, which is Balfour's Declaration, where they, write this declaration to Rothschild. This name gets now thrown into all the conspiracy theories, but to Rothschild, who was a very wealthy Jew at the time in Europe, that they look upon favor the Zionist project in the Palestinian Mandate. By that time, they had this thing was called a mandate, but a colonial relationship and sort of managerial oversight of the wealth and of the governance of what we know as Palestine and Israel, and it extended into Jordan and to the east to almost the Euphrates. But Lebanon and above was not. That was French, which is why the French have a special relationship there. And then the project from then on, the sort of picked up steam, and everybody calling themselves a Zionist in these times knew exactly what they were talking about. They knew exactly what the project was, which was Jews going to Palestine, and they were trying to drum people up in this whole regard. And as anti-Semitism and the World War I to World War II era started to really ramp up with much more overt and dangerous anti-Semitism, causing a lot of Jews to really seriously question whether they had a future in Europe and starting to flee. Even Albert Einstein's of the world and Hannah Arendt's, they were interested in this thing called Zionism because Hannah Arendt had to, flee, and Einstein as well. And they very quickly kind of slowly backed away Homer Simpson to the weed or the shrubs gift style of this thing called Zionism, because they knew already this thing was kind of being taken over, not as this innocuous little, like, well, let's just go hang out in this place called Palestine. The real estate's really great. It was a project that was quite aggressive and actively, was a mix of, yes, buying some land. I know a lot of the Zionists want to whitewash the whole thing, being like, we just bought it and everyone left. Buying some land, already engaging with these clashes with the local Arabs. The relations in the land was, getting quite tense and bad already in the 20s and 30s, especially with the relations to the British Empire. So I could keep going beat by beat through the history. People should really read the history, but the argument becomes of like, well, what does Zionism really mean? And to me, it's a project that you could tell this very innocent story about, of like, it wasn't safe in Europe, we just need a safe place to be. This is the land we're choosing. The only problem with all of that entire story is that there was a people there called the Palestinians, and what are you going to do with those people? And the argument that you would incorporate them into this view, that they would just sort of, be governed equally under your Zionist regime, never ever was the dominant or winning philosophy on the ground in Palestine. Never. Maybe there were some small voices arguing for that, and they were killed. I tell one of the stories in the series about Yaakov Israel. And there's plenty now of religious rabbi Jews and anti-Zionist Jews that you see at the protests and stuff. Those histories are really, really interesting. So Zionism is a largely exclusive and dominating ethnic project in the land of Palestine, trying to pave the way in that area to make a safe place for Jews. That's what it is, I think.
Yeah. So there is and this definition, it has evolved, right? So that's one of the issues, is that there's a lot of people, a lot of Jewish people whose parents escaped the Holocaust, World War II, who, when they hear Zionism, they think of that as the reason that they exist today, right? They think that, okay, if it wasn't for this project, if we wouldn't have a place to go, ancestors wouldn't have a place to go, they would have been eliminated, eradicated at a generational level. And so it's a matter of, and then the thing is, there is this whole historical, political, context behind the word, but at the same time, the way that it's perceived when people say, okay, no, we're anti-Zionist.
Perceived, yeah. I want to just, I don't want to cut you off, but I want to underline that word perceived, because even that story is like an incredibly small percentage. Gideon Levy's father has it, but Israel is not a land of Holocaust survivors who just happen to show up on the shores and build the land. I think a lot of people think that, right? It's an incredibly small percentage of the population that did that. Most of them went to America or other places, even after World War II. This wasn't like people were clamoring to go to Jerusalem in this place. I mean, some did, some were. There weren't a lot of options. Yes, this is a shame of the world.
But there was the expulsion. Yeah, there was the expulsion of Jews also from a lot of Arab countries, right? And I know, like,
yes,
the populations have dwindled. So just in the sense that, and I agree, yes, the majority of people don't know this. A lot of people think that Israel is mainly just all European descent Jews, and it's not. The leadership is, again, that causes issues. Obviously, causes a lot of consternation in these conversations. And again, we could just keep going and going, and it becomes more and more complex. But there is the way that I'm just really interested right now in the psychology of this conflict and how these terms mean different things to different people. And when you have an entirely different lexicon happening, this sort of disparate lexicon, then question just comes up, and you did this, you facilitated this conversation in Islam and the Future of Tolerance, and the question is, how do you get people to talk when they're just coming from completely different perceptions and lexicon? And that's sort of one thing I wanted to get at. So there's this other term that you use in the series, which I thought was really, really useful, and that's tribal essentialism. Right. So that's again in the first episode. Yeah. And so you talked about tribalism. That's, obviously the tribe that you're on. And then essentialism you defined as an attitude where there's a certain category of intentions and desired outcomes which are not considered from the very start of the analysis when it concerns the behavior of one's own tribe. Yeah. And you repeated that twice because it is a little hard to hear, like, for people who are listening, just generally. So can you explain that? What do you mean by tribal essentialism, and why is it so important in this context? Yeah,
I think so. I was distinguishing it from something like racism, which I defined as sort of an outward facing prejudice. Racism is about really concerned about the other being this less than, or slime or insects or non-human, and we hear plenty of that stuff. There are real racists, but I think what is much, much, much more common, even in the people who are expressing some of that stuff from time to time, is what I'm calling tribal essentialism. And so, it works in the way where it's, an event happens, something happens in the world, and you need to decipher why it happened. This is what we do as animals. We're just sort of natural scientists. We're always looking for explanations of why it happened. And there could be 1,000 reasons for something to have happened. Some, you look outside your window or something, and someone's injured with a stab wound and someone's running away. You're like, oh shit, like, why did this happen? There could be 1,000 reasons for that to happen. But the tribal essentialist, just if the, let's say in my little silly example, is like the one who did the stabbing or whatever, who was holding the knife, is of your tribe, and this is very automatic. These aren't like conscious thoughts that you do this. This happens sort of automatically and subconsciously. If you're an essentialist, if you're in the habit of it, you over a whole series of potential explanations for this stabbing or this behavior that you saw that results in this thing. You just jump over it, so you don't consider that it was like a hate or just a murder, or they just wanted to kill this guy, or all the untoward stuff, or that that person was just really just wants to kill that person because of what that person is, or because of their religion, or because they want their land. These are like, that's what irrational people do, right? Or that's totally crazy. Like, you're going to kill that person because God told you to do it. Yeah, like, these are all crazy things. You don't even consider them. You jump over, and you're like, oh, there must be rational reasons for this.
Must be a reason, yeah.
And when a reason, you would eliminate everything else, but there must be a reason, and you're just thinking of rational reasons. When we say that, we think, self-interest is rational. So like, oh, maybe they must have had their reasons. Maybe it was self-defense. That's self-interest, right? Of course. Or maybe it was collateral damage, or maybe it was a mistake, right? Like their intentions are good here. I know that. I don't need to question the intentions. That's another way to put this essentialism, is you assume the intentions are not murder, rape, pillage, take. You just assume that.
Yeah, because you are synonymous with the tribe, and you are not a bad person. So you think that nobody else in the tribe is going to think
bad intentions. Yeah.
Yeah,
like you just don't look at those things, no matter. And then if the evidence, and there's always an out, because if the evidence, you start investigating and you're like, it sure looks like a murder, you'll always have this out where you're like, well, there's some bad apples, or their anger got the best of them. We're going to punish them. And that's what distinguishes me from this other tribe. And so, but if, so go on, you get it. That's an essentialist.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of give a couple of examples where, because when I heard that, I was like, yes, it was like a sort of a bingo moment, because I've been trying to explain this even to myself, right? This phenomenon that we're seeing. And so the one example is, for instance, with the October 7th, the violence that was done against women in Israel, what Hamas did, the rapes and the just really, really brutal.
We should also mention, of course, a lot of that has come to be also exaggerated. And so I wish the horrors were horrible enough that people didn't need to exaggerate them. I don't know if you've, the 40 dead babies that somehow Biden still thinks he saw, and all this kind of crazy stuff.
No, yeah, I agree with you. I think it has been exaggerated, but I mean, those things that the rapes.
There was terrible things. There was terrible.
There were terrible happening. Yeah. So those things happen. So it's kind of interesting that with people, I know people in the Arab world. I grew up there. They always talk about these guys in their own country. They're watching themselves, or like we want to make sure that a lot of these guys are very creepy and so on. So they'll recognize that in the context of their own, when they complain about their own neighborhoods, or that going to the market and having men do all kinds of things. But when they go into another place, they're absolutely pristine. They're not going to do anything. So that's one sort of example that I thought of. And the second one that's more recent is the World Kitchen, the WCK, right? The cars, they've cleared out their path with the IDF. They've got huge logos on their roofs, right, at the top of the cars. They're precision bombed, which is apparently something that Israel said, hey, listen, we can't do everything with precision. Well, in this case, it was very, very precise. 1.6 kilometers apart, these cars
on the water. This is not a dense, they're not like it's not hard to see what's going on. They're not in a crowded street.
They're driving by the water. And this is sort of very elemental. And this is, again, we're talking about a country, Israel, that has carried out assassinations of Iranian authorities and officials through AI and through robots, and so they're extremely precise, and in this case they're very extremely precise too. And there's just no way to paint this as an accident. We know there's a history of weaponizing food. We know there's a history of the strategic aspect of preventing food and water from getting there, all of that. But it's a very uncomfortable truth for people to take. And I see, people, even with that level of evidence, logos on the top, precision targeting by the water, 1.6 kilometers apart, even with all of that, no, their intention must have been good. Yeah,
it was a mistake.
And so that's why I think, it's, and I see this, like I've seen this on the side that I grew up on, you're clearly talking about it. So I think you really nailed it when you used this term. And I think it's,
thanks. I worked hard on it. And I also want to just one more note while we're still on this subject is that I also wanted to make clear that this is, the circle you draw of the tribalness in that definition, which then leads to the essentialism, doesn't need to be religious or racial or even familial. It could be Western. It could be a sports team. And this is not unique to Jews. I mean, one of the biggest messages that I think everybody needs to be getting across in all of these arguments is that Jews are not special. They're like everybody else, and they're susceptible to the same failings that of tribal essentialism, and so are the Palestinians, etc. That this is a human problem, and we're all capable of doing these things. And I think that's kind of a scary thought for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think it's also a little it's a lot less overt than what you said about racism or bigotry, like, which is really about the other. It's about the other not being as good. But tribal essentialism is sort of something that I think all of us, including you and me, right now in this moment, could potentially be blinded by when we're talking about our own tribe. So that's why I think it's just so important to think about, if you're being reflective. I wanted to move on to the protests that you're seeing. So another thing, you and I have talked a lot about free speech, like over the last many years that we've known each other, and this has been a very frequent sort of discussion just in the culture right now throughout the world. What is free speech? Does it have limits? Is it okay? And each side of this has their own idea of what free speech is, and it changes and evolves, and the goalposts keep moving. And it's, and again, I don't even know, you're talking about these terms becoming meaningless over time. That's the one I'm most concerned about, that this is a term that becomes meaningless. So there are protests that are happening right now, and which I actually think are legitimate. I think that there are elements of it that are anti-Semitic, that are actually just, and there are people from Gaza, and activists from Palestine who have looked at some of the things that these students are saying, and they're disavowing them. But for the most part, I think that these students, they have this cause. They're seeing things on their TikTok feeds. They're seeing kids, little children being blown up, and all of the really indiscriminate kind of reckless killing that's happening in Gaza right now. And everybody's just talking about, well, this is just something that happens. They're talking now, everybody's discussing justifications for, the Hiroshima bombs. So like, well, we have to do that too. And it's just the whole conversation has become so strange all of a sudden.
Yeah.
So starting with some of these slogans, right? From the river to the sea, right? The slogan. So you mentioned that, this was originally, I think it was originally a Zionist slogan. It was in Likud's founding charter, but they meant the Euphrates, right? They didn't just mean Jordan.
That was so what's interesting when people get into the history of, I hate using the word terrorism, as you know, because it's become propagandized already. But what we would all recognize and call as terrorism, of Zionist terrorism pre-1948, the Irgun, the Stern Gang, the Haganah. If people go into the histories, they'll know these people are blowing up. What's that?
That was like they were targeted, right?
They were blowing up civilians and the King David Hotel. They were targeting Arabs certainly, and British as well, for not allowing, in their eyes, enough immigration to come in. But yeah, planting bombs, writing religiously crazy, justifications for it in poetry. Some of them secular, some of them religious. Like all these movements, it was political mixed with religion. But their slogan, which and they comes from the Bible. I'm talking about the Irgun now, I believe. Has an image. It's a hand holding a rifle, and the image behind it is a shape. That shape is called Eretz Yisrael, which means Greater Israel, which goes from the river to the Euphrates. What's interesting, and why I tell that story as well, is literal members, someone like Menachem Begin, who was a wanted terrorist and then suddenly becomes the prime minister after assassination, the second prime minister. Am I getting that right? By the time he gets into the office, is he still trying to get the land all the way to the Euphrates, or is he, what I mean? Like, it's always interesting. And I talk about that with Richard English, about taking terrorists at their word of their stated goal or whatever. If we had a time machine till 1935, would some intellectuals we know who are like, you have to take terrorists at their word when they're saying these things, would they support the Zionist movement? That would be, they're like, look, they're saying they wanted to just make the entire land. That's all of Syria, modern day, all these places. They want to take the river to the entire, the Euphrates River to the Mediterranean Sea. I'm going to believe them when they say this. They're terrorists. Look, we should believe them. Well, okay, what happened? Now you're like, oh, these are the good guys now. Okay. So it's, it gets tricky when you use kind of this T word. So like I want to try something, and I haven't really focus grouped it yet. I'm working again behind the scenes on some other things which I think are interesting. But what you were mentioning, from the river to the sea, makes it into the Likud charter. The Likud is just a renamed party from what used to be called the Herut Party. It means freedom, which was Menachem Begin's party. It's a direct line to the terrorist groups pre-1948. Yes, they say from the river to the sea, and no one seems to care. What I think gets complicated here, I like where we're going with this. You're talking about free speech. I don't love conversations that get into the deontological consequentialist battlefield of rights and principles and, who's a hypocrite, because everyone's a hypocrite when you're talking about those two things all the time. And everyone's seeing that, out there. So why I don't like it is because nations, isms, ideas, they don't have rights. There's no such thing as a free speech right for Israel or Palestine or something. And so when people say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, I think it causes some understandable confusion. Palestine is not a thing which could enjoy freedom. Neither is Israel. Neither is America. These are not people. These are nations. These are concepts. People can feel freedom and dignity and self-worth and security and all the things that make up this larger concept of freedom, I would say. So I would offer the tiniest edit in people's minds. Hopefully they can chant enough of it if this gets 1 trillion views, but it should be.
Oh, I know what you're going to say. Can I guess?
Yeah, you probably got it. From the
river to the sea, Palestinians will be free, right?
That's it.
I've been thinking about this for the longest time. Did you see that video of I think Norm Finkelstein was addressing the encampment, the protesters?
I didn't see it. No.
Yeah, where he suggested the same thing. He's like,
oh, good. I'm glad we're all thinking the same thing.
Like, can we? And he is, as sort of pro-Palestinian and left you get on this. He goes. And he just told the protesters, he's like, can we just suggest an edit, because this is very confusing to people.
It's just harder to chant. That's the problem.
Yeah. It's like Palestinians will be free. And then they just ignored it. They just came up and they repeated the slogan right in his face. These things are hard to do, but who would disagree with it? And I think it cuts to the point. It cuts to what I started this conversation of with like Zionism or all these things about, I think, let's be honest, I think we're all searching desperately for the lever that we can pull that stops this madness. Maybe on every side, right? Like people might be watching this thinking, oh, this guy just hates Israel. I'm like, no, like, listen, we all want a solution. We all want, October 6th was not a solution. October 7th was a problem. And everything that's happened since has been a problem. I think we could all admit to that. We all want to solve that problem differently. And that's where the politics get into the problem. But it's the lever that needs to be pulled, and I'm pretty firm on this, is particularly Americans, because Americans hold a lot of weight of this issue. Maybe American Jews too, but the globe, the world at large, is to really understand the Palestinian struggle and what it is. We can be horrified by the methods by which they have come to try to achieve it, which, of course, unfortunately, is not how it's always been. They didn't start with violence. Everyone who says that is an essentialist and probably covering their tracks. The history will show you they did not start with violence in this, and that the Zionist regime has been violent from the very beginning as well. Like this is a cycle of violence that escalates and escalates and escalates. The Palestinians do not just understand force or understand violence or whatever. That stuff is garbage. That stuff is probably just pure racism for whoever says it. And the history should embarrass anybody who says that kind of thing. So none of what I'm saying is to excuse what Hamas did or anything like that. But the lever we need to pull is to get particularly confused, I think, Americans, including the people on the camps, right? We were going to talk about this. I don't think all those college kids waving the signs or whatever know exactly what's going on either. I think we could psychoanalyze them in an interesting way, and maybe the next topic or wherever we go next to broaden it a little bit. But that is so misunderstood of what the Palestinian struggle is. And when you put it that way, that Palestinians will be free, but not even just the word free, like what
what are the elements? What are the ingredients that you need to mix? Even freedom is not a thing, I think. I think it's a emergent state of communal relations where the ingredients are much more fine-grained than that. Things like dignity and opportunity. And this is a really important one that needs to be done for all humans, I think, to feel some sort of freedom, even if we're talking in a relationship, a romantic relationship, a communal relationship, a family, anything, is acknowledgement and recognition of historical pain and injustice. That is the tripping point here, because nobody wants to admit that, especially because it's so painful, I think, for American Jews, but for the kind of the self-reflection of the Zionist project to admit being a rather cruel perpetrator of injustice for quite some time. Now, of course, there are reasons, maybe not justifications, but reasons for that to have happened, that are incredibly useful to have in this, whenever we can finally get to the day where we can begin the healing and the reconciliation, which I'm optimistic. If everyone watches the series, you'll actually see through all of my criticism and difficult intellectual journeys through the history, I'm actually optimistic. I think we will get to reconciliation. That's the part. So all those ingredients is what it means to be free. And Palestinians did not have it on October 6th or any year, really back to 1897 onward. It has been stripped away from them violently, piece by piece by piece, and the world has sort of not done anything. And it cannot continue. The future that we build now cannot resemble the past, and that's the lever that needs to be pulled here. And I don't know if I'll stop talking now, because I don't know in which way you want to connect this to the college campus conversations, but I mean, I think there's bigger, meaningful ways to do that now, because I know it's not particularly on this free speech issue, because I think the free speech thing is a bit of a red herring. And it's just going to get into it's just going to get into another one of these principles and the limits of free speech and incitement and all this kind of stuff, that I think is a little bit of noise under a much bigger, more important kind of energy and ethos of the world's hyper focus on this problem, which I think has also confused a lot of people, right? Including someone like my mom.
That is confusing to a lot of people. Why? Because there is a sort of a disproportionate kind of amount of
like million UN resolutions. Yeah, right.
That's put on this, and I think it is fair for people to say that especially in the Muslim world, in Syria, Assad kills 500,000 people. Or Omar al-Bashir, the Arab Muslim, kills 500,000 Black Muslims in Darfur, and you don't really see these kinds of protests, but when this happens, it does. But there's a
can I address that? I don't know if you're gonna stay on that. I have things to say about that, but you can go on.
Okay, yeah, sure. I just wanted to I just wanted to point out one thing. Actually, is really less of a question, more of a thing. I had May Salam, who's a sort of a Gaza war survivor, on this podcast. I had a conversation with her, and I found it really interesting. She talked about a lot of things. So she talked about how her family's still in Gaza. Her brother's injured there. She's been trying to help them. She's trying to rally everybody else to sort of help them as well. So she's going through a lot right now. But she talked about Israel, obviously, and everything that Israel's doing, and the dehumanization of Palestinians, and she was born and grew up in Gaza. She also talked about how Hamas made this decision to go out and do this thing October 7th, and then just threw all of the people in her country under the bus. Sure. And she said, ultimately, we don't care about this. I just want my family. I don't care about the land. So she's thinking about it, from that perspective. And then she also talked about the Egyptians, how at the Rafah border crossing, Egyptian border authorities are now, these Palestinians, these Gazans are trying to escape. I mean, that's very, very strongly enforced by the Egyptians, and they're charging them up to $10,000 US dollars per person to get out of there. They're allowing the aid to come in, but then they're selling the aid to the Gazans. And so she talked about all of these things. I sent it to people I know, or friends, some of these, young students even who are out there protesting and, with their keffiyehs and everything. None of them were interested in it. None of them were interested, because there's a sort of a simplistic idea that they have. The tribal essentialism is like, we've got this one side. So when they hear somebody who's actually been there, whose family is there right now, talking about how Israel walked all over us, but so did Hamas, and so are the Egyptians, everybody's screwing us over. It doesn't fit very neatly into one of those boxes, right?
That's a great point. I think I want to try. I think I could try to synthesize all that together, because I'll start with the Palestinians have been so screwed by a lot of elements of history and psychology and stubbornness, and some honorable stubbornness that I could get to, that like they have just so much on them. I feel like they get used as pawns by so many different factions in a bigger game than themselves. And the pawns get killed when you're playing chess, right? The pawns are the sacrificial pieces. And it's just heartbreaking. And so I want to try to analyze the forces at play here. It's a perfect example and a perfect question. And those protesters should not be ignoring it, of course, right? People should take all of these things incredibly seriously, and it should highlight the urgency of the emergency. This is a 5-alarm emergency, and it's not new. It's been a 5-alarm emergency since 1948, which is, so I want to try to make the case that, and I do this in the series. I forget if it's in part 1 or part 5. Those are the sort of bookends of what the original series was going to be, where it's just me. I think it may have been part 5, where I make the argument that you brought up killings in Assad, and during these last 6 months, there was the bombing in Iran at the funeral, or the anniversary of Soleimani's death, and like 72 innocent Iranians get blown to bits by someone who I think they claimed ISIS. I think that's right. In this killing, and you don't hear much about it. It makes like a blip in the news, and there's no protests and whatever. And I think so. Here's the what I said even in that piece. I said, a lot of people, they think this is a good argument. They're like, you don't really care about Palestinian bodies. You don't care about Muslim bodies. You're out here crying these crocodile tears for all these dead babies. But where were you when Syria was happening, or Iran, or Sudan right now is like on the verge of a genocide too? Like, where are you there? And the truth is, and this is hard for people to hear, they're right. You don't just care about dead bodies and dead babies. That's not what motivates humans. It's not, unfortunately. Yes, it's part of it. We don't like seeing it. It alerts this kind of ugly thing in our cognitive dissonance, but we could quiet that voice very easily. What we care about, what ignites us, what gets us from the time we're young children mad and excited, is justice and injustice. And honestly, most Americans are pretty ignorant about like what the hell's happening in Iran or Syria. Like, I don't know, these people are killing each other. I don't really know a lot about the history there. Like, trying to explain, I couldn't tell you what the Sudan genocide is about to be, I don't know who I should hit the streets in favor of there. If what I really care about is justice, sure, I could be like, I'm a pacifist. I want everyone just to get along. So this just angers me. Yeah. And there's truth to that. There's plenty of just good-hearted people who just want everyone to get along. But people hit the streets, and people go to the UN, and people cry and make a fuss when there's injustice that they feel is so obvious. That's what motivates us as humans. And I know this is hard for the Zionists to hear, people who don't know the history. Palestine is like a perfect storm of so many of these human relations. Of you have sort of a color dynamic in a large degree that sort of feels imbalanced there. But the historical story of Zionism and the Palestinians who were there really feels, for anybody who scratches the surface, to be a monumental story of injustice. And so it motivates us. We want to find a solution to that, and we show up, and it's every resolution. There's also particular reasons, of course. It was like the UN's first pet project, right? The UN was this new toy, and they make a partition in this land, and and it's been failing. The UN has a lot of reasons to try to make that not a failed project. So the hyper focus. So that what I'm trying to make the case of is that, and why that student didn't respond to you, is that Palestine, these chants, these slogans, this thing that's happening on college campuses, I think is a symbol. It's not just about Palestine and Zionism. It's a symbol about colonialism and imperialism and these big isms that feel like historical injustices, which maybe are continuing in the world. You know, I put this in the last piece too. Are people might be confused to find and see. I found 3. I think there's plenty more. 3 portraits of George Floyd wrapped in Palestinian garb on the wall in graffiti in the West Bank, right? Like, and you're like, what does George Floyd have to do with Palestine? He probably couldn't find it on a map when he was alive, right? It's probably true, but yes, it's a global, it's a global story, like the BLM affinity for the Palestinian cause and all this kind of stuff. And Jews should know this better than everyone. I grew up hearing about the Jewish activists who were marching alongside the civil rights movement in America because this is an ethic about standing up against injustice. That's what you're seeing here as sort of a global protest against really big forces, a global world order that I think a lot of people are beginning to call bullshit on because of they're sensing the inherent injustice in so much of it. And so that is terrible for the Palestinians who are like, why am I at the center of this bullseye of a global revolt against how we got here, the history of all of these dynamics and all of these forces, and it completely sucks. I'll just say, like, I don't know if this is going to happen next, but the drumbeat of this bigger pulse that I'm talking about in the psyche of the human project, the political human project now, back from like pre-Occupy in the 90s, we used to see people protest like the IMF and the World Bank in Seattle and throw cocktails. Like there's this energy, and then it kind of morphs into Occupy Wall Street, which then coincides with the Arab Spring. Now, I think that's what you're probably seeing now. This has sort of been tried before in some other places, but people would be very scared of this term. But I think globalize the intifada is what probably needs to happen next. And at that point, and we're talking about symbology and words here, that word intifada is not about Zionism in particular and what happens on the border of the West Bank. It's about a global shaking off of, like, we do not like the power structures of this world that you have been telling us are going to deliver equality and freedom and neoliberal, economics is going to work eventually. Yes, we see Steven Pinker's graphs going in the right direction, but man, I don't think it's worth it if it takes this kind of collateral damage to get there, even if we think your end game is right. And we're not on board anymore. And guess what? By the way, also, we're not so happy even when we get the rewards of it, because we're fucking bored out of our minds and lonely and on TikTok. And, like the Western world is having a crisis of meaning even when it gets the goods of this global world. And so I think we're seeing some huge cracks. And yeah, Palestine, and your friend in particular, it's fucking heartbreaking, is like right in the middle of the crack in that column. And I wish they could get out and not be stuck in it. They're the ultimate pawns. I mean, God bless the Palestinians. They are so screwed.
Yeah, and Jade, again, that word that you use, the intifada, that also, it's a very, very contentious word.
Yes.
Means different things to different people. To some of them, it's what led to their freedom. It's like Zionism. It's something that led to why they're still alive today, why they still exist, why they're potentially going to be liberated. To others, it's that's the problem a lot of times, is that, if you are, say, if you were one of the 1,200 people on October 7th, or if you were, one of the people whose child was killed October 7th. I saw this. I don't know if you saw the conversation between an Israeli and a Palestinian. There was a TED conversation where they speak.
No, I'm actually, I'll tell you better.
Yes, I'll send you that.
I know it.
That's I think one of the best things, and because I know you're optimistic about a reconciliation here. I am too, by the way. I think, these things they're the worst things that have been reconciled in history, right? I mean, people get along in Japan and Germany. These things have a historical. There are good, happy endings to these things, but one of the the Israeli man in that dialogue who's speaking, the guy from Gaza, his brother had been killed by the IDF.
Mm-hmm.
This guy, his mother had been burnt to death. Both of them had loads of people doubting their stories.
His name is Moaz.
Moaz, yes.
As well. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, I should have mentioned his name. So there's also when you talk about like tribal essentialism, you know, the way that we're talking about this, and I don't know what tribe I'm in now. You know, used to be liberal, leftist, progressive. I don't even think any of those things apply anymore. Mm-hmm. But when you're talking about justice, that the reason that we're motivated by this is because of justice. Are we engaging in tribal essentialism of ourselves and sort of ignoring the fact that anti-Semitism could also be part of this? I mean, there's a question, and this goes back to the campus protests as well, right? I mean, and I know there's a lot of people feel very strongly about this, but I grew up in the Arab world and the Muslim world, and that is also a thing. It is a real thing,
sure,
right? So, should we be discounting that completely? Because if we do that, then the people who are experiencing it on that side would feel just as, would also feel not listened to in a way that the Palestinians wouldn't. And I know that you can't really compare, but also, and it's
I mean, we shouldn't dismiss. I think that's the word you use. We shouldn't dismiss anything. Yeah, of course it's a real phenomena. I think, it shouldn't be controversial to say the ADL has exaggerated it greatly my entire life. I challenge everyone who maybe just was pissed off with what I said to go to their own website. We did this ages ago. You, me, and Amin Navabi. Remember this?
Oh yeah,
when a cartoon came out in the New York Times. We should show the original cartoon, because the original cartoon, gosh, I think everyone would love it today. I don't know, and the ADL would certainly call it anti-Semitic and call me a self-hating Jew for even suggesting such a terrible thing. It was a cartoon. Well, people should go to the site now, because I think they'd be shocked. Search it. Go to like ADL political cartoon anti-Semitism. They have like a collection going on right now.
Sure. And go ahead and look it up.
Yeah, and you mentioned this before, the danger of making the word anti-Semitism a weaponized, ridiculous word. I mean, when Netanyahu is trying to call Al Jazeera a terrorist newspaper or something like, or a terrorist outlet, I think it's a good sign. I think they're getting pretty desperate. I would say people know that they're not anti-Semites who are out there on those college campuses. I'm sure there are some people saying some dumb stuff, and they'll get caught on camera and they'll get amplified. I'm sure of it. And like you said, I'm sure there's people who genuinely believe it. Like they've come to hate the Jew, not just the Zionist or the Israeli. I am sure of that, right? So
are you sorry to interrupt, but were you talking about the Trump Netanyahu dog cartoon?
The Trump Netanyahu dog is the one that you and I talked about. Yeah, about 8 years ago or something now.
Let me share that here so I can kind of show it to. And if you're listening to this on, I'll just describe it to you. Hold on, let me share my screen, I guess. Tab to share. There we go. So, is it on?
Yeah,
there it is.
That's the one.
That's the one.
This is the one from so many years ago. I wonder if they have a collection now, right?
They do. This one as recent as 2023. So they do collect these. But this was a cartoon, so I'll just describe it. It showed President Donald Trump wearing a Jewish yarmulke, walking a dog. That looks like and represents Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on a leash with a Jewish Star of David. So the dog has a Star of David on it, and Trump is wearing a yarmulke and he's got this dog on a leash, this Netanyahu dog on a leash. So that's the cartoon that we discussed time ago.
This was so bad, apparently, right? This was so anti-Semitic that the New York Times issued this massive apology for it and shut down their entire political cartooning tradition because of this thing you're looking at right now. Unbelievable to me. I mean, crazy to me. So my challenge then still stands. Ali, no one has ever taken me up on this challenge. Draw a cartoon, a political cartoon, which does what this one is trying to do, pokes fun or lambasts the special relationship between the United States and Israel and is critical of it. Draw it, publish it under an Arabic sounding name, and see what happens. Nobody has ever yet done this to me. Publish it in an American newspaper and see what happens. Because the ADL will come shut you down so fast. I've grown up with these ADL people. If you look on their own website and go through their map of this like rising tide of anti-Semitism, click on a bunch of them. Just click on a bunch of them and see how many of them are graffiti. Yeah, I know graffiti could be really, really triggering for kind of people. Just see how many of them, or even worse, being like someone had a Free Palestine shirt and flipped over a garbage can outside of my, garage or whatever. This is all for me to say, I agree with you. Of course, there's real anti-Semitism in the world, and there's people who would absolutely do harm to Jews just because they're Jews. All these kinds of efforts are doing of calling these kids on college campuses or whatever anti-Semites or is just going to pave the way for us not to see, the real instances when those rise. I can't even tell you. This is the ADL's fault. I cannot even tell you what the real state of anti-Semitism is in the world right now, because they've called everything anti-Semitism.
Yeah,
they'll call me saying this anti-Semitism right now. I like, you do not know how freaking crazy these people are. I mean, they should be so. I mean, they are. It's such a joke. The AIPAC and the ADL have done more, and I've been saying this since I was 11, to kill Judaism and probably put more Jews in danger than any other group that I know in the West, because of what you exactly said. And that I'm not exaggerating. Like, they will call every single instance anti-Semitism. Do you remember when Golab, whatever his name is, at the UN a couple days after October 7th, showed up with a yellow armband at the UN or like the yellow Jewish star? I mean, it's so offensively insane to people, even in my own family tree, who died or perished in the Holocaust, for them to be doing this kind of garbage. Every single time they mention October 7th, they say the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. Are you talking 6 million versus 1,000 or whatever the number ends up being that were perished by Hamas? You're going to go with that comparison? I mean, who's diminishing the memory of the Holocaust at that point? Obviously it gets me upset. I'm really infuriated. I don't even know how to answer your question, because it's sick how many times these things actually get chased up, where like swastikas are showing up on, someone's door at a college dorm or whatever for months and months and months. And then we find out it was the person themselves doing it, or it was someone from AIPAC or something. I
want to point this out, that this is something we've talked about with the term Islamophobia as well. Like, for many years, I wrote about it in the book, and I know that you've been very, very consistent on this, is that there are genuine victims of anti-Muslim hate.
Yes.
Right, who are whose credibility is now just completely in question. It's down the toilet, because so many people have misused the term Islamophobia, and someone didn't get like an open Coke or something like that on a plane, and then that was Islamophobic. Every little thing is Islamophobic. They're talking about Imran Khan in Pakistan is talking.
Can I give you a story? Can I give you? Just sorry, I just want to give you a personal story on this.
Let me just finish what I said about Imran Khan.
Yeah.
So there's so he's talking about how there's so much Islamophobia in France, while he's completely okay with China, and they're sort of pretty much concentration camps for 1 million Uyghur Muslims, and there's these things, they really don't mean anything. And you're right, it is infuriating, because there are people who are victims of anti-Semitic attacks. These college campuses, there are things I've seen the videos, and I completely agree that there are instances where people are being overtly anti-Semitic. And it just doesn't mean anything. Nobody takes it seriously anymore, because it's, like you said, everybody, especially Netanyahu. I mean, he's coming up, and I think he's probably done more damage to Israel.
I'll give you a story from my family, because I mentioned my mom earlier, and I won't use any names here, but I have her cousin who I'll peg him politically is a Republican, but an anti-Trumper Republican. Comes from the generation of quite attached to the story of Zionism and Israel as a miracle and needs to be defended, and has generally a nervous disposition. We'll say that. Yeah. And after October 7th, he watches a lot of news, of course, and things are getting loud. He was taking a trip to Washington, D.C., and he was nervous about it because he read and knows that there is a large Arab population there, especially of taxi drivers and Uber drivers. So in preparation for this trip, he wanted to let my mom know, I think, maybe to, by the way, she wasn't fully on board with this, but he was going to change his name in the Uber app. His last name happens to be a very obviously Jewish last name, to something like Smith or whatever. It was like, Jason Smith, or whatever. Not the name he used, but something very innocuous. And he wanted to give her like this helpful tip to help survive as a Jew in the world. Now, if that story got out in the reverse, that somebody was going to, Brooklyn or something with an Arab name, and they wanted to change it because they were there was a synagogue there, and they were going to be picked up near a synagogue, and they quickly changed their name, and the ADL found out about it. And the ADL, you would find that as an instance of anti-Semitism so quickly. Is it an instance of Islamophobia as well? I don't know. Like, we can argue about like these things. Like, I was like, that's pretty fucking like racist and stupid, but I get it. You're staring at the news all day and you're nervous and you're hyped up. And so I tell that small story to tell you that like the atmosphere and the rhetoric and the fear, of course, is going to lead to more confusion and fear and sort of fear of the other that is going to be construed by whoever wants to construe it as being this rising tide of, the scary time for everybody. As far as I know, in America since October 7th, there's been a couple shootings and deaths associated directly with it, and they were Muslims. I don't know any Jews who've been killed because of it in America. So is there anti-Semitism? Sure. I don't know. Those 3 kids who got shot in Minnesota, or the kid who got shot in Chicago or whatever, like we'll try to keep our heads on straight or whatever, but don't fall for the anti-Semitism trap. I warn people, I hate that I've even talked about it this long on this, to just ignore it. It's so stupid. It's such noise. Yes, there are real instances of anti-Semitism in the world, and yes, we should take care of them as as police matters and protect these people. But if you're not an anti-Semite and you're out there with a Palestinian flag, even if you said something stupid or got a little sloppy, apologize for it or whatever, and be like, maybe I got a little too angry there. I meant Zionism. Try to be precise with your language, but don't give in to this garbage. Don't give in to the garbage. It's a cover for a genocide and a slaughter in Gaza. Do not fall for this garbage. Do not fall for it. You're not being anti-Semitic to be pro-Palestine or say from the river to the sea, Palestinians will be free, or even Palestine will be free. Don't fall for that crap. Don't fall for it.
No, got it. I'm gonna have to. I didn't even get through half of the stuff I wanted to ask you, and I got to go in like 10 minutes. But I do want to ask you so 2 more things. Right. First of all, talking about, we haven't talked a lot about Hamas. You've talked about the Palestinians, the Palestinian resistance, how, what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. But is that something right now? The problem is there is when a lot of these pro-Palestinian protesters come out, and by the way, I've never seen this before. Talking about your optimism. When I grew up, it was just a given that okay, the only story we're going to see is this one side because they have all the power. Never going to see what's happening to the people in Palestine, and to see that kind of support in the U.S. is just something I've never seen in my life, and I think among young people, it's over 50% now. But they look at it and they think it's a pro-Hamas rally. All of these protests are pro-Hamas. Okay? So do you make, and I think, right, and I've talked to Palestinians who think this too, like Palestinian activists, that it's important for Palestinian protesters also to make a distinction between who they are and Hamas. I know that it seems unfair. It shouldn't be their job to do that. It shouldn't be their responsibility. Just like it shouldn't be the responsibility. It shouldn't be the responsibility for Muslims to differentiate. Like, hey, we're Muslims, they're terrorists. There's a difference. It shouldn't be necessary, but it kind of is. What do you think about that? How do you the Hamas factor? Like, and I'm not going to ask you, can you condemn them, please?
No, that's the thing, is like, I don't like the game of condemn.
But it's when they do ask them to combat, there's times I've been frustrated where they're very good voices for the Palestinian cause who are extremely credible. They're making good arguments. They would be listened to. And there are people who want to. There's a lot.
Are you sure? This is the thing. Are you sure they would be listened to?
I
just rewind the clock, and it's so. This is the painful part of it. Is I don't know if that's true. So yeah, go on.
No, I'll tell you. I think that they would be listened to. I think that
by who?
By who? Well, a lot of the youth in the United States that didn't know about this issue, that are seeing it for the first time, hearing about it for the first time. So these are people who listen to people who are talking about the cause, right?
Yes,
that's how these.
I see what you're saying.
Happen. Yeah. I saw the comedian Andrew Schultz, who's very, very popular. He was speaking in his podcast about. And he's very widely listened to. He's like, I don't know much about this conflict now. It's like really blown up everywhere, and I hear one side and I feel like they're right. I hear the other side. I feel like they're right. I don't know what to think. So and it is because they're getting these messages from everywhere, and not everybody's as literate about the history of it. So, and I've seen these voices. They've come on, and they are very articulate.
Yes,
and they just won't. When people ask them to, hey, can you condemn Hamas? Can they just say, okay, yes, of course we do. That's a separate thing. I'm here to talk about the Palestinian cause focus, because if they don't, a lot of times, then the rest of it is all okay. This person is defending Hamas. That's a huge problem. So just in terms of a messaging strategy.
Yeah, this is a question maybe for Mookie on the messaging, because I would urge everyone to go listen to my conversation with Richard English on this subject of resistance versus terrorism. I completely understand why they don't want to do that. I mean, again, because the word condemn is silly. Forget about the condemn thing. I'm just saying, I get you.
And acknowledgement. Like what May said on the podcast, she acknowledged that, okay, what Hamas did, they made a decision on behalf of her family, and then they just went into their tunnels, and they put everybody else under, right? And they didn't consult the people before they made the decision. So there's a lot of antipathy towards them.
Same with the Israelis up till October 7th, where they made all of the decisions that led to Hamas doing what they were doing too. So we could go back and forth of who pulled the trigger.
I agree with you. I agree with you on that. I'm not disputing. I'm just saying
that's why those conversations always derail before they start. I'm sure you've watched them too, where someone's like, "I'm not gonna. Why are you asking me this first?" And you never ask the Israeli guy, "Why don't you do that?" I mean, that's why they always kind of derail.
I do agree with that completely. But how do you? I'm not asking you to condemn them or anything, but Hamas is a factor in this. How should that be handled and talked about on the pro-Palestinian side, or should it?
Yeah, I think it shouldn't be talked about that much. I would also avoid it, like the people do on the show, because it's a trap. Because the West has a big bad terrorism word, and whenever that gets used, and it's just a propaganda game that you will lose if you end up playing that little poker game with someone at a desk at a news station. I think they should focus on, I'm going to keep reiterating, the validity of the Palestinian quest and struggle. It is a struggle for justice. Some, maybe like the friend you've mentioned, are like, I'll make do here. Just keep me in Gaza. Leave me alone. This is okay. Some, right. And like they didn't sort of get to make that choice for themselves of like, just leave us alone. We'll just deal. There are plenty of people who are in that world. But not most, I would say. And I don't know those numbers. They're hard to get. If you look at the polling in Gaza and in West Bank, it doesn't tell the story of some crazy extreme jihadist nation, right? It tells the story of a political problem which hasn't been solved, which is dangerous as hell, as we've seen all the time. So yeah, I would say that they should focus less on the methods by which they attempt to engage in this struggle, and simply voice their frustrations with that they haven't been heard, they haven't been addressed, that this injustice continues. They're not going to go away. they might be stubborn, and yeah, maybe sometimes they're trapped in there, like by Egypt, to be like, yeah, we don't want you to go away, we want this problem, and that's completely unfair.
Well, the entire Arab world. I mean,
Arab world is like,
right? Like
stay there. Yeah, there's an interesting movie. Gosh, I wish I could remember the name, in Lebanon. It's called The Insult, or An Insult. Interesting movie if anyone looks it up. That gets into Palestinians in Lebanon and the racism that they face, which is really just sort of because they're kept as perpetual refugees by everyone. It's really, really complicated. Like if you give a Palestinian a job in Lebanon, it sounds like you're doing this wonderful thing, the refugees, but no, you're actually doing the bidding of the Zionists, because the Zionists want the Palestinians to just give up and leave and disperse into the Arab world already, because that's what they've always wanted, right? So you don't do it. So they get used by everyone. It's a mess. So I would say that they should be screaming about not, it's interesting you mentioned Moaz. Actually, behind the scenes, I'm working on some things about helping the messaging of these things. I think what the world doesn't need to see more of is just reminders that Palestinians are humans. I think people actually know it. They know people, they just don't want to look at it, right? It's painful to look at it, but they know there's a lot of death happening. They could tell themselves all these stories, and the story that they, I'm sure, try to tell themselves in the West is that it's necessary. It's just collateral damage, and we're in a trolley problem, like I lay out in the in my series. Yeah, and so that's not what even Americans, I don't think, need to understand right now, or most of the world, or the college kids. Or what they need to understand is regardless of the methods of how it has been tried to be achieved, which I do not condone. So I'll say that right now. I'll say that instead of condemn, I'll say I don't condone the way that Hamas did it. I certainly wouldn't do it. Do I believe any of the garbage coming out of their mouth of the religious stuff? Of course I don't. Do I share and understand the frustration? Absolutely, and everybody should. That's the complicated thing here, right? And I think even in a weird way, there's cracks of optimism in all this darkness. I'll give you a couple. One is that, even after 9/11, people like you and I were plunged into this conversation of like, wait, we need to talk about this well and figure this out, because this is a mess. And it was the same question: why do they hate us? What's going on? And part of everyone discovered, whether they were indifferent or ignorant to it beforehand, that Osama bin Laden was kind of screwed by the Americans, right? We trained him, and he fought the Russians, and they kind of left him. And maybe no one gets all the details of what happens there, but they can kind of get like, that's kind of shitty. Like, he kind of got pissed off, but still, like, yeah, he shouldn't have killed all those people, right? Like, you're able to sort of separate these little cracks. And then there was a moment to bring it back to 9/11, because so much of this conversation, the backdrop is still like, I like to think in these bigger terms, is 9/11 in America. When Joe Biden landed a couple of days after October 7th and gave the infamous bear hug to Netanyahu, but didn't meet any of the Palestinian leaders or Arab leaders. And he gave this little speech. It's before Biden really kind of went full on. Maybe it was a moment of honesty. I don't think it was scripted. He warned, people might remember this kind of little warning of like, we know you're in pain. Don't go crazy like we did. And everybody knew exactly what he was talking about. Like, the anger, we were hurting. 9/11 was really crazy, and we were all traumatized. And then we did a lot of crazy shit that turned out to be insanely stupid, right? In the nicest sort of interpretation, like bad strategy, or not tactical, or misguided. And in the worst strategy, opportunistic, and stealing the oil and killing a bunch of people, whatever it was. We did a lot of crazy stuff in those times that is regrettable, morally regrettable. I'll say morally regrettable. Maybe there's people who were like, it was great, it was worth it, whatever, but morally regrettable. And he gave that little warning there. And now, what are we, 6.5 months later? Is that the out? Is that the escape? Is that the way for people to sort of just hit the brakes on this thing and say like, wow, everyone makes mistakes here, and we made some really big mistakes. Maybe we can find that handrail in here. But then back to the essentialism point, and then I'll wrap it up. That's what you do as an essentialist. What I just did in walkthrough was my tribe. the Western world makes mistakes when we're emotional, right? Like, we didn't really mean it, guys. That was, remember 9/11 was really painful, and we kind of lost our minds a little. You understand, but and then you don't extend that to not your tribe, and this is the really hard thing to do. Extend that to the Palestinians. Get rid of your tribalism and being like, and this is why history is required in the conversation. Our 9/11 was one awful day. It makes the news. You could talk about the Nakbas one day, but like their version of that, like, boy, we got emotional and did some really awful, morally regrettable things, has been 100 years of being on the wrong side of a very violent settler or colonial project. If you can extend that, maybe there is like this modicum of like, okay, yeah, I don't condone any of that. I don't condone Abu Ghraib. I don't condone 9/11. I don't condone October 7th. I don't condone any of these things, but we're all susceptible of this. We're all human. These aren't righteous fights or just mistakes or missteps.
They don't happen in a vacuum. And I was, we talked about this. So we, like Mookie and I, in the last episode that I did with him, talked about the sort of the psychology of trauma and just the idea that, and I don't know if Richard English talked about this, but there's several people who study this, the idea that every perpetrator of terrorism usually starts by thinking of themselves as a victim. Right? It always starts that way, and this applies to state terrorists, it applies to individuals, it applies to everybody. So there's and I think it's I would love to. I'm gonna have to have you back at some point, because I want to actually talk about you. When you're saying that people need to understand the Palestinian struggle, which I 100% agree with, and people need to understand the history. I want to talk about the messaging, because I think that we may. Yeah. I want to hear your point of view on it, because I think about it a little bit differently. So I'd love to sort of get into that. The messaging, with any of these things, the messaging is super important. And then how do you do it, and how do you plan it? But the last question for you, just really quick. I'm
never quick, but I'll try.
Quick, but I'll try. Last question, just for you. And it's a so you've probably gotten this a lot, but with your positions and everything that you think about this, and even your colleagues and some how you've broken from some of them. How do you navigate your own sort of identity and beliefs in relation to this conflict when you're called, say, a self-hating Jew, or when you're called somebody who's ignorant, or how they say there's gays for or queers for Palestine, or blacks for Trump, and things like that. They put you in that category that you're kind of selling out on people. How do you? Because that I dealt with that a lot too in my context. So how do you deal with it?
I really mostly just ignore it, and I see it. Actually, the gays for Palestine thing, or Gaza even, I address in that it's in the 5th part, along with the George Floyd thing, and I think it'll make sense to people of what's happening there. And again, I don't doubt the confusion, but I warn people, like, just don't be the kind of people who freak out about this thing and kind of misunderstand it without doing just a little bit of charitable psychoanalysis to someone who might be saying something kind of like that just is ignorant or not fully informed or whatever. People speak and address and even insult in symbolic ways in that way. So if I get someone calling me a self-hating Jew, I don't know. I search for, and I got plenty of it, believe me, in my inbox. I search for as charitable a psychological explanation as I can for them. It goes in a weird way. It goes to my last answer when I was talking about violence and emotional trauma, like you said, and maybe national trauma. It's the difference between seeking an explanation is not synonymous with providing a justification. You can seek an explanation for Hamas's behavior, or even the IDF's behavior, or even Osama bin Laden's, or whatever. That's what people should be doing. And we didn't talk a lot about religious motivation in this, which is the main sticking point of my break from the other colleagues who just put that variable on the table and then I was horrified to learn. I thought it was on the table along with the others. It's on the table and they push everything else off. And I think it leads to tremendously shallow, bad analysis, which has other essentialist motivations for doing such a thing. And it's a problem. But seeking explanations, including religious ones and metaphysical ones, even for the people who are writing to me, because every now and then I get stuff that's purely religious, Jewish stuff coming my way of why I'm wrong for like these biblical reasons or Talmudic reasons. I extend charity. I try not to take it too seriously and too literally. I personally am not worried about anti-Semitism causing danger to me, but the only time I ever worry about it is the deeper and deeper we get into the successful merging of the word Zionism, Israel, and Judaism to be inseparable to people, to be so confusing as to people that because of my last name, which you can see right there, lumps me into a category which I have spent my entire life trying to unvelcro those three things, and then frankly leave them all, because I don't identify as Jewish either.
No relationship to Ben Shapiro, right?
No. Well, probably you go back far enough, you'd probably find one, but no. So that's how I would answer it. That's in I think the fifth part. So yeah, I've referenced my series a lot because that's where I did most of my deepest, more, let's call it polished thinking than this kind of off the top of my head conversation with you. And so I encourage people to check it out. If you disagree with me or agree with me, you'll get a better version of it there either way.
Yeah, it's and everybody should check it out. And yeah, thanks for this, Jay. And I have to have you back, so I'm going to press you on it. So I really want to continue this conversation and just understand some of the things you said, because there's a lot of things you opened up. I am still like there are some parts of the series that I haven't watched, and I know that when I watch them, I'm going to want to talk to you again. But cool. Yeah, thanks for coming on to do this. To consider this part one. Anybody who's listening to this, I gotta, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you know when there's more stuff like this coming. That way, when you do that, it helps put this in front of more people if you think these conversations are important. Also, you can follow us on Instagram at Unlicensed Therapists Podcast. And if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Music, or not Apple Music, what is it? iTunes or Apple Podcasts? Yeah, please give us a rating, because that also puts it in front of more people. So appreciate it. Thank you, Jay. And hopefully to be continued. And keep doing this work, man. It's fantastic. Everybody, please, links are in the description to Islam, the Future of Tolerance, the documentary, the Palestine series that you've done most prominently, and a bunch of the other things that Jay's working on. His blog, the essays that he writes are also incredible. So I know that you're very good behind the camera, but you're also, we need you in front of the camera as well.
Thank you. I'll try to keep up with the energy with it. I'm working on a lot of this stuff, and I can always improve. And like you said, the messaging, if I'm an expert at anything or trying to be an expert at anything, it's communication and finding the right language for stuff. And if it helps, I'm grateful for it. And then if I can be helped with some of it, I'm always grateful for it. So come my way too. If you find my series or this conversation, I think we're in a hugely important fulcrum of our species and of the civilization, and it's important that we get this right. So I'm just trying to figure out how to help. Yeah, and I would actually, just one suggestion is just the tribal essentialism concept. If you make it like a really short, even a reel about what that is, just so that people know to be aware. It's such an important part of just self-awareness when you're thinking about these things. So yeah. Anyway, thanks, Jay.